Good morning and welcome to this introduction to the book of Kings in our Bible in a year. And the reason why I say introduction to the book of Kings is you might already be thinking, well, there are two books of Kings, 1 and 2 Kings. But the reason why I say the book of Kings is because in the Hebrew Bible, the book of 1 and 2 Kings are just one book together. So that's why we're doing this introduction as simply the book of Kings. Now, the book of Kings has a lot in it. We've got prophets in there. We've obviously got a lot of kings. We've got a lot of major events that happen. You've got the splitting apart of a kingdom that makes Brexit look like a walk in the park. You've got the destruction of Jerusalem. So there's a lot in what we're going to read. In fact, it spans a period of over 400 years from around 1000 BC, which is the end of David's rule, to around about 586, 587 BC, which is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Babylonians. So a lot that happens in this time period. I was thinking as I was just looking at some notes and thinking about these readings that we're coming into, of how you measure a reign of a monarch. And of course, we have done that as a nation far more recently than we're used to, because after more than 60 years on the throne, our former monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, passed away. And many people were therefore thinking about what kind of reign did she have? It was such a long time, actually over 70 years, wasn't it, in the end, that spanned such change in society. So many different things happened whilst the Queen was head of state. And so when she died, lots of people were thinking back and going, well, what kind of monarch was she? And how do we measure her alongside the other great monarchs of our history and our past? And because she's the first truly kind of modern monarch, it's hard to measure her against those who have come before. And what do you use to measure? What standard do you use to measure her reign? Now, in some ways, that's the kind of questions that we're asked in the book of 1 and 2 Kings. 1 and 2 Kings isn't merely a historical book in the sense of it being, here's some facts, here's some dates, this is what's happening. You don't measure Queen Elizabeth II's reign by those standards. You don't say 1952 she became queen, 1953 she was crowned, 2022 she died. You don't just give the main dates. You talk about other things. One of the things I've heard Christians talk about particularly is her faith, and the way in which, many of you will have, I'm sure, sat and listened to Queen's speeches or broadcasts and heard a very deep personal faith and how that shaped her life and her reign as our monarch. And it's the same with the kings that are mentioned in the book of 1 and 2 Kings, is that they are measured too. There is an assessment that is made of the kings who are there, and 39 kings across 400 years are assessed in the book of Kings. But the standard that they're assessed by is not simply a historical one. It's one that is, how did these guys live? And I'm sorry, ladies, it is almost always guys. How did these guys live in light of who God was calling his people to be? And as I mentioned before about in Samuel, you have the first Messiah, as in the first anointed one, Saul as the first anointed king, that you have the role of the anointed king, the Messiah king, is hugely important in the life of the nation as a people seeking to live as God's people in the world, as a people seeking to shine a light into the world of who God is and what it means to be his people. The role of the king was hugely important. It sets the tone for the the life of the nation. You see, with Queen Elizabeth, what happened, I think, was that towards the more recent decades of her life, she understood that society was changing and therefore reflected that change in what she chose to embrace and how she went with those changes in the life of the nation. In the days that we're talking about, in the 1000 to 500 BC kind of time periods, it was the king who shaped society. It was the other way around. The king, the tone the king set was very much how society lived. And so if you had a good king, then that king would preside over a nation that was following God closely. If you had a bad king, and a bad king defined by not living as the person God wanted him to be, then you often saw that the nation went through periods of unfaithfulness as well. When you see the big split, spoiler alert, at the end of Solomon's reign, then part of the problem is that Solomon, with his many countless wives and concubines and his harem, worshipped other gods, and Solomon was kind of drawn into the worship of other gods through those relationships. You then saw an increase in the worship of other gods in the nation because people thought, oh, well, if the king's doing it, then surely that's okay. Surely we can do that too. And so the king lived as a litmus test, but also as an example to the nation that he led. And so that's what we're going to read about in the book of Kings. But I want you to not just read it simply as a historical book, but to read it as, how do these people measure up? And you can sit, not in judgment in a bad sense, but you can be part of that assessment too, part of that appraisal for the kings that are mentioned in these books. How do you feel they lived up to who God was calling them to be? And I guess then the question is, for us who are not anointed kings or queens, how do we live in light of who God is calling us to be? That if people were opening up the book of our lives in years to come, would they read that we were being faithful to who God is calling us to be? So I pray God blesses you as you read these words and as we continue on this journey together.